Imagine standing in a marketplace in Rome, and the thing being sold is a person, not a horse, not a length of cloth. A woman, maybe 19 years old, standing on a low wooden platform while a man circles her, checking her teeth the way you'd check a fig for softness. There's a placard hanging around her neck listing where she's from and what she's good at. No one asks her name. In the eyes of Roman law, she doesn't have one that matters. She is officially a thing, a res, property, the same category as a chair, or a plow, or a jug of oil, friends. Tonight we're going somewhere quiet and a little heavy, the daily life of enslaved women in ancient Rome. Not the marble senate, not the emperors, not the grand mosaics you've seen in documentaries. Just an ordinary day, lived by an ordinary woman who owned nothing, not even her own hours. If you'd like, dim the lights now. Pull a blanket up over your shoulders. This isn't a frightening story, just a true and gentle one, and it's all right to let your eyes close whenever they're ready. Let's begin. You wake before the sky changes color. In most Roman households, enslaved people slept in a small room off the kitchen. Sometimes 6 or 7 of you packed into a space barely bigger than a modern walk-in closet, sharing thin mats stuffed with straw. There's a particular sound to that room in the dark. Someone's breathing, someone's shifting weight, the soft creak of a door as the first person rises. No rooster crows in the city. Instead, you learn to wake by feel, by habit, by the small ache in your shoulders that tells you it's time. Your name, if you're lucky, is still your own. Many enslaved people were renamed by their owners. Something shorter, something Latin, something easier to shout across a courtyard. If your name was Amara, you might now answer to whatever your owner preferred to call you. You'd learn to respond to it the way you'd learn any other command, quickly, without hesitation. The first task of the morning is almost always water. Rome had aqueducts, yes, remarkable ones, carrying water for miles on graceful stone arches. But that water mostly filled public fountains, not private taps in ordinary homes. So you walk. Some mornings it's 4 trips, some mornings 6. Each one carrying a clay jug that weighs almost as much as a small child once it's full. Down the stairs, along the street, wait your turn at the fountain. There's always a queue, always someone's elbow in your ribs. Then back up, 3-4 flights. Water sloshing against your ankles the whole way, 6 trips. 40 pounds each time. That's nearly a quarter ton of water carried on foot before the sun is properly up. There's something almost meditative in it, if you let yourself think of it that way. The rhythm of your feet on stone, the cool morning air before the heat arrives. A woman 2 households down always hums the same 3 notes over and over, and after enough mornings you find yourself humming them too, without meaning to. Once the water's fetched, the fire needs tending. Roman kitchens didn't have stoves the way you're picturing them. Just a raised hearth, a bed of coals kept just barely alive overnight, so it can be coaxed back to life in the morning rather than started from nothing. You blow on it gently, feed it small twigs, watch the first orange threads catch. It's oddly peaceful, that small private fire, the only warm thing in a cold room, the only thing in the whole house that morning that seems glad to see you. Breakfast in a Roman household was a modest affair. Bread, sometimes cheese, sometimes leftover porridge from the night before. You'd have your portion after everyone else had theirs. Whatever remained. Some households were generous about this. Many were not. By the time the household is stirring properly, your day has already been going for 2 hours. Now, here is something the history books tend to gloss over, and it deserves to be said honestly, without flinching and without lingering. For enslaved women in Roman households, sexual access was treated by law as one more thing an owner was entitled to, the same as any other use of their labor or body. There was no concept of consent that applied to an enslaved person, and no legal protection against it. This wasn't hidden or rare. It was woven into the ordinary structure of Roman slaveholding, openly acknowledged in law and custom alike. We won't dwell on the details of it here, because the details aren't the point, and this isn't the place for them. What matters is that it happened, that it was legal, and that it was simply one more burden layered on top of already endless labor. Something a woman carried alongside the water jugs, and the mending and the cooking, with no door to close against it, and no one whose job it was to intervene. It sits there, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day, and then the day simply continues. Because it had to, by mid-morning, the household has its own small economy running, and you are the engine of most of it. If you served a wealthier family, your tasks might be specialized. Perhaps you were trained specifically in hairdressing, spending hours each day braiding and pinning the mistress of the house's hair into towers of curls, heated with iron rods, kept warm over a brazier. This was a skill, a real one, and skilled enslaved women were sometimes valued for it, the way a modern household might value a particular chef. It didn't make you free, it just meant you were harder to replace. If you served a more modest household, your day was a patchwork. Spinning wool in whatever spare minutes existed, grinding grain by hand in a stone quern, a task so repetitive that Roman writers joked about it being the punishment given to particularly troublesome slaves, mending tunics, minding children who were not your own, preparing the midday meal. Here's a small, dry truth of it. Roman households of any real size ran almost entirely on the invisible labor of women who left no names in any surviving record. We know the names of senators. We know the names of gladiators, chariot racers, poets. We very rarely know the name of the woman who spun the wool that became the senator's toga, or nursed his children, or kept his fire lit for 30 years. History, it seems, has always been better at remembering the people being served than the people doing the serving. The midday meal, when it came, was often eaten standing, or in brief snatched minutes between tasks. There wasn't really a lunch break as such, just a pause, taken where you could find one, sometimes in a doorway, sometimes on the kitchen floor with your back against the warm stone of the hearth. In the afternoon, if the household included children, you might find yourself, quite unexpectedly, in one of the gentler corners of this life. Enslaved women very often served as wet nurses and childhood caregivers and Roman children. This part is true and rather touching, frequently grew deeply attached to the enslaved women who raised them. There are surviving tombstones, paid for by grown Roman citizens, honoring the nurse who raised them, sometimes with more warmth and detail than the epitaphs for their own biological mothers. One reads, roughly translated, "To my nurse, who was more a mother to me than my mother was." It's a strange, aching kind of tenderness, a bond that was real, sitting inside a relationship that was fundamentally about ownership. The child might genuinely love you. The child's father still owned you. Both things were true at once, and nobody at the time seemed to find that especially strange. You might spend an hour of your afternoon simply sitting with a small child, telling a story, humming something half-remembered from wherever you were before Rome, a hill town in Gaul, a port in Syria, wherever your life had been interrupted and rerouted here. Children like repetition, so you'd tell the same story 3 days running, and by the third day you'd both know it by heart, and there was something almost like peace in that. As afternoon wore into evening, the pace didn't really slow. It just changed shape. There was the evening meal to prepare, lamps to fill with oil, the household's laundry to see to, washed in many homes, using a solution that included stale urine as a cleaning agent, a detail Roman writers found endlessly, dryly funny, and one of the very few places in this world where a joke was actually allowed to breathe. There was mending by lamplight, quiet in a way the rest of the day wasn't. If you were fortunate, your owner was someone who noticed diligence and rewarded it in small ways. Extra bread, a warmer blanket, occasionally, the promise of eventual manumission if you served long and well. This wasn't kindness in any way we'd recognize today. It was closer to investment. A well-treated slave worked harder, lived longer, was worth more. But small mercies, even calculated ones, still felt like mercies to the person receiving them. If you were unfortunate, the same evening held the threat of a beating for a spilled jug, a scorched loaf, a moment of visible exhaustion, mistaken for insolence. Roman law placed almost no limit on what an owner could do to punish a slave. There were no courts you could appeal to, no neighbor whose job it was to intervene. Your body, your hours, your safety All of it existed at someone else's discretion, and yet, somehow, life kept its small textures, the smell of bread, the particular blue of the sky just before dark, the three-note hum drifting up from 2 houses down, joined tonight by another voice, and then, quietly, by yours. By the time you finally lay down on your straw mat, the room already breathing with the sleep of the others around you, the day had asked everything of you and given back almost nothing. Still tired, still someone else's, still somehow yourself underneath it. But there was one part of Roman law, small, narrow, almost accidental, that occasionally let a person walk out from under all of this entirely. A door that opened, rarely, and never for the reasons you'd hope. There was one part of Roman law, small, narrow, almost accidental, that occasionally let a person walk out from under all of this entirely. It was called manumission, and here's the strange thing about it. It wasn't an act of mercy written into law, because Romans believed slavery was wrong. Quite the opposite. It existed because freeing a slave, under the right conditions, could actually benefit the owner, publicly, socially, even financially. A freed slave often stayed bound to their former owner in new ways, owing labor, loyalty, sometimes money, for years afterward. Freedom, when it came, rarely arrived clean. Friends, if you're just joining this part of the story, settle back in. We left off with a long day finally ending, water carried, fires tended, a child's story told twice over. Tonight we follow that same thread forward, into the rare, narrow ways a person could step out from under Roman slavery altogether. Let your shoulders drop again. There's nothing here to brace for. Just history, told slowly. Let's start with the numbers, because they're worth sitting with. Historians estimate that in the city of Rome itself, during the height of the empire, something close to 1/3 of the population may have been enslaved at any given time. And yet manumission happened often enough that freedmen and freedwomen made up a real, visible portion of Roman society, walking the same streets, running their own small shops, sometimes even growing wealthy. It's a strange contradiction sitting right at the center of Roman life. A system built on permanent ownership that nonetheless let a meaningful number of people out the other side. For women specifically, the paths to freedom looked a little different than they did for men, and it's worth walking through them gently, one at a time, the way you might walk through rooms in an old house. The first path was simply the will of an owner. A master could free a slave outright, for any reason or none. Gratitude for years of loyal service, a deathbed change of heart, sometimes simple whim. It happened more often than you'd expect at the moment of an owner's death. A will read aloud, and buried somewhere in the list of property being distributed to heirs, a single line granting freedom to a particular household slave. Imagine standing in that room. Imagine hearing your own name read out, not as an object being passed to someone new, but as a person being released. We know of one such case from a funerary inscription, a woman named Optata, freed in her owner's will, after what the inscription describes only as many years of faithful service. We don't know what those years contained. We don't know what freedom looked like for her the following morning. But her name survives, carved into stone, which is more than most enslaved women in Rome were ever given. There's something worth sitting with here. The entire arrangement depended completely on the whim of someone else. Your freedom wasn't a right you held. It was a gift someone else could choose to give, or just as easily choose to withhold, right up until their final breath. A cruel owner and a kind owner could treat the exact same years of service in entirely different ways. And there was no court, no appeal, nothing you could do but wait and hope. The second path was more active, and in its own quiet way, rather remarkable. Buying your own freedom, under Roman custom. Enslaved people were sometimes permitted to keep a small private fund, called a peculium. Technically still the property of the owner, but functionally treated as the slave's own savings. If you were skilled, or simply diligent over many years, you might be allowed to take on small side jobs in whatever spare hours existed, weaving extra cloth to sell at market, selling herbs you'd grown in a corner of the courtyard, doing mending for neighboring households for a few coins here and there. Imagine saving, one small coin at a time, toward the price of yourself. It's a strange kind of arithmetic, working extra hours on top of an already full day, in order to purchase the very thing that should never have been for sale to begin with. A skilled woman might need years, even a decade or more, of this quiet accumulation before she'd saved enough. And there was no guarantee, at the end of it, that an owner would actually agree to the sale. Legally, they didn't have to. Many did because a peculium arrangement worked to their benefit too. It gave you a reason to work harder, to stay rather than run, to hope rather than despair. But the final choice was always theirs, still. Some women did it. Some women, coin by coin, spinning by lamplight after an already exhausting day, bought themselves back from the people who'd bought them first. The third path is the one that tends to surprise people most, and it's worth telling gently, without rushing past it. A woman could sometimes be freed specifically in order to marry the man who had owned her. This wasn't romance in the way we'd picture it today, or at least, not only that. Roman law forbade marriage between a free citizen and an enslaved person. So if an owner wished to marry a woman he'd enslaved, freeing her was the only legal path forward. Some of these arrangements were, by surviving accounts, apparently affectionate, long partnerships that outlasted the legal transaction that began them. Others were simply another form of control. Freedom traded for one set of obligations into another. There's a funerary monument from the 1st century, commissioned by a freedman for his freedwoman wife, that reads with what feels like genuine warmth even across 2,000 years, praising her thrift, her devotion, her constant presence at his side. We can't know from a single stone what the truth of that marriage really held. Grief has a way of smoothing over complicated histories. But the inscription exists, carefully carved, clearly paid for, with real feeling behind it. And that much, at least, seems true. Whatever path brought a woman to freedom, the door on the other side wasn't quite as wide open as we might hope. A freed woman still carried the label, Liberta, for the rest of her life, distinct from those born free, and often still owed formal obligations to her former owner, now legally her patron. She might still work in his household. She might still need his permission for certain legal actions. Full citizenship, in the truest sense, usually belonged only to her children, born after her freedom, who could grow up with none of the marks their mother had carried. There's something quietly moving in that. A woman's freedom, hard-won or simply granted, might matter less for her own remaining years than for the child she raised afterward. A child who could walk through Rome as a citizen from birth, never once required to answer to a name that wasn't theirs, never once made to carry water before dawn because someone else owned their hours. The freedom didn't erase what she'd lived, but it changed, permanently, what came next. We know remarkably little about most of these women as individuals, their inner lives, their private grief, their private joy. What survives is mostly fragments, a name on a tombstone, a line in a will, an inscription praising thrift and devotion. But fragments, held carefully enough, still tell you something true. They tell you that a woman lived, that she worked, endured, sometimes loved, sometimes triumphed in the smallest possible ways available to her. A saved coin, a freed child, a name finally carved in stone under her own choosing, still unfree for most of her life. Still, in the end, however briefly, herself. And there's one more quiet thread worth following before we let this whole story settle down for the night. What happened, generations later, to the descendants of these freedwomen? Whether the mark of that early bondage ever really faded, or whether it lingered, soft and unspoken, in families for 100 years afterward. Here is something quietly remarkable. Within 2 or 3 generations, the mark of slavery could disappear from a family almost entirely, not in memory, but in law, in standing, in the way Rome saw you when you walked down the street. A freedwoman's child, born after her manumission, was simply a citizen. Nothing more needed to be proven, nothing more needed to be earned. And that child's own children carried no trace of it at all, at least not on paper. Within 3 generations, a family that began on an auction platform, priced and inspected like livestock, could produce a grandson who owned property, voted in local assemblies, perhaps even served in minor civic office. Rome, for all its rigidity, had this one strange softness at its edges, a forgetting, built quietly into the passage of time. Hi again, friends, if you're still here with us. We're in the last stretch of tonight's story now, so let yourself settle even further than before. There's nowhere else this needs to go tonight, and nothing left to brace for. Just a slow, quiet unwinding, all the way to the end. We know a little about how this forgetting actually worked, because Roman funerary inscriptions are unusually honest about ancestry, almost proud of it, in a way that feels almost touching across all these centuries. A freedman would often have his former status carved directly onto his tombstone, right alongside his name. Libertus, freedman, son of no one in the eyes of Roman naming convention, because enslaved people had no legal father to be named after. And yet the very same stone might list, with visible pride, the accomplishments built inside that one difficult lifetime: a modest business, a respectable marriage, children who would carry the family forward as full citizens. There's a particular kind of dignity in that. A man or woman choosing to carve the hard truth of where they started directly into permanent stone, not as a shame to hide, but as a fact to be proud of having moved past. For the women specifically, the ones we've spent this whole evening walking alongside, carrying water before dawn, saving coins by lamplight, waiting out someone else's will for a chance at freedom, their names rarely made it onto grand stones of their own. Far more often, if they're remembered at all, it's as a small mention on someone else's monument. Mother of, wife of, nurse to. A woman folded quietly into another person's story, the way she'd so often been folded into another person's household. But every so often, just often enough to matter, a stone survives that was clearly paid for by her, for herself. A small, modest marker, sometimes barely a foot tall, listing nothing but a name and the plain fact that she had once been enslaved and was no longer. Nothing grand, no praise, no poetry, just a name, chosen and claimed, standing in stone long after the mouth that once spoke it has gone quiet. It's worth pausing here, gently, to think about what an ordinary evening might have looked like for a woman 2 generations removed from all of this. A granddaughter, say, of someone whose whole youth had been spent exactly the way we described earlier tonight. Water carried before dawn, a fire tended by feel in the dark, days measured out in someone else's needs rather than her own. This granddaughter, by contrast, might run her own small household. She might have her own hearth to tend, her own children to raise, her own modest savings tucked away, not toward buying her own freedom, because she was born already free, but toward a slightly better winter, a slightly larger home, the same small hopes any Roman household might quietly carry. She likely never thought much, day to day, about the grandmother whose entire early life had been spent as someone else's property. Why would she? It wasn't spoken of directly, most likely. It simply sat quietly underneath everything, the way old foundations sit underneath a newer house, unseen, unmentioned, but load-bearing all the same. That's often how history actually moves, in the end. Not in sudden, dramatic turns, but in this kind of slow, generational settling, hardship folding itself gently under the floor of the next life, still there, still shaping things, but no longer visible on the surface. And so we come back, at last, to where this whole story began. That woman on the auction platform, standing quietly while a stranger checked her teeth, a placard around her neck, listing everything about her except the thing that actually mattered. We don't know her name, we never will. But we know, now, something of the shape her life likely took. The water carried, the fires tended, the small unbearable things endured, without anyone whose job it was to intervene, and, just possibly, somewhere at the far end of it all, a door that opened. A will read aloud, a small hoard of coins finally sufficient, a stone, however modest, carved with a name she chose to claim as fully her own. Maybe she never saw that door. Many didn't, but some did, and every one of them, known or unknown, named or unnamed, deserves to have been remembered gently tonight, the way we've tried to do, not as a shocking fact to gasp at, and not as an entertainment, but as a life, a real one, carried quietly forward, the same way you're being carried now, gently toward sleep. Still tired, still remembered, still, in whatever small way history allows, hers. If this story kept you quiet company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe on your way out, but only if it felt worth it to you. There's no pressure either way. Let your eyes rest now, if they haven't already. The lamps in that old Roman house went out a long, long time ago. Yours can too. Before we let this story rest completely, there's one more quiet room worth stepping into. The handful of places where these women's own voices, or something close to them, actually survive. Not stone carved by someone else in their memory. Their own words, or as near to their own words as we're ever likely to get. If you're still here, still drifting, that's exactly right. Nothing urgent left tonight. Just a few last soft pages before the lights go all the way out. Most enslaved women in Rome couldn't read or write. Literacy was rare enough even among free citizens, and rarer still among the enslaved, though some, particularly those trained for household roles requiring correspondence or accounts, did learn. So when we go looking for something closer to a first-person voice, we mostly find it in unexpected, humble places. Not letters, not diaries, curse tablets, mostly, and graffiti, and the occasional line scratched into wax or clay almost as an afterthought. Curse tablets are a strange, oddly comforting little corner of Roman life to spend a moment in. People, enslaved and free alike, would write out grievances on thin sheets of lead, asking the gods to intervene on their behalf, then roll the tablet up and toss it into a well or a grave, trusting it to reach the right ears. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these scattered across the Roman world, and a number of them were clearly written by or for enslaved people. One, found near a well in Roman Britain, curses a specific person for stealing a cloak. Small, human, almost funny in its pettiness, and entirely unconcerned with grand history. It's just someone, furious about a coat, asking the universe to fix it. We don't know for certain that a woman wrote that particular tablet, but we know women wrote others like it. Somewhere, once, an enslaved woman sat with a stylus and a thin sheet of lead and pressed her actual grievance into the world in her own hand, trusting that a god, at least, might listen even if no earthly court would. There's something almost sweet in that stubbornness. The world gave her no legal voice. She found one anyway, however small, however unofficial, however unlikely to be answered. Graffiti tells us something gentler and a little funnier. Roman walls, genuinely, this is true, were covered in the same kind of casual scribbling you'd find on a modern city wall or a bathroom stall. Love notes, insults, boasts, bad poetry. Some of it, preserved by pure archaeological accident under volcanic ash in Pompeii, gives us an oddly intimate glimpse into ordinary lives, enslaved and free tangled together in the same wall space. One line, scratched near a Pompeian bakery, simply reads, translated loosely, something to the effect of, "Whoever loves, let them thrive. Whoever doesn't know how to love, let them perish twice over." We don't know who wrote it. Free citizen, freed person, someone still enslaved. The wall doesn't say, and in that single anonymous moment, it genuinely didn't matter. A person, however constrained their daily life, still had enough of themselves left over at the end of a long day to scratch a little unearned poetry into a wall on their way past. That, more than almost anything else in the historical record, feels like proof of an inner life that no amount of ownership could fully reach, a quiet, dry thought to close on. 2,000 years later, and the most honest thing left on a Pompeian wall might just be a joke about bad lovers. There's one more kind of voice worth mentioning gently before we finish. The letters, rare but real, exchanged between enslaved people and the free family members they'd been separated from, often preserved only because they were quoted, second-hand in someone else's surviving correspondence. A Roman writer named Pliny, in one of his letters, mentions in passing the grief of a household slave upon hearing news of a relative's death, not as the main subject of his letter, just a small aside, a passing observation about a person's private sorrow that he clearly found worth noting down. It's such a small mention, a single sentence really, buried inside someone else's unrelated correspondence, and yet it's one of the only moments in the entire surviving record where an enslaved person's grief was written down at all by anyone for any reason. Not because the loss mattered to Roman law or Roman history, just because, for one paragraph, a writer noticed a person feeling something and thought it was worth remembering. That's really all any of us ever get to leave behind, in the end, whatever century we happen to live in. A few small traces, a curse over a stolen cloak, a line of bad poetry on a wall, a single sentence in someone else's letter, noting that we grieved and that our grief was real. So let's leave her there, the woman we began this whole evening with. Off the auction platform now, in whatever life came after, water still needing carrying most days, most likely, freedom or not, because water always does. But somewhere in her, too, a curse she might have whispered under her breath at some small daily injustice. A line of poetry she might have hummed without even meaning to, a grief, real and hers, that someone, somewhere, might have quietly noticed and never quite forgotten. Still tired, most days. Still, in the small ways history allows, seen. That really is the whole story tonight, friends. Let the room stay dim a little longer. Let your breathing slow the rest of the way down. There's nothing left to carry tonight. Not water, not worry, nothing at all. Seef well.